I am the Director of Public Programs at Polis Project. Today, we're very pleased to welcome Christian Parenti. Christian is Associate Professor of Economics at John Jay College, City University of New York, and as a journalist, he's reported extensively from Afghanistan, Iraq, parts of Africa, Asia, and Latin America for publications like The Nation and the New York Times, among many others. His books include Tropic of Chaos, Climate Change and the New Geography of Violence, The Freedom, Shadows and Hallucinations in Occupied Iraq, The Soft Cage, Surveillance from Slavery to the War on Terror, and Lockdown America, Police and Prisons in the Age of Crisis. His latest book, which we're going to be talking about today, is Radical Hamilton, Economic Lessons from a Misunderstood Founder, which is out now from Verso Press. Christian Parenti, welcome to the Polis Project Book Salon.
Thank you very much for having me.
Absolutely. So let's just jump right in. You know, the Revolutionary War, you argue, was formative for Alexander Hamilton, though not in the ways in which, we've been traditionally led to understand. Can you talk a little bit about the ways in which Hamilton's experience of the war and the ways in which Hamilton's experience of the war sort of shaped him and the ways in which he thought about the state and economy and his subsequent approach to both in theory and in practice?
Yeah. Well, he begins as a frontline officer, but then after a year of being in combat, he is offered a position on Washington's staff. And from that vantage point, he gets an Archimedean, an overview of the conflict. And he also sees the conflict very much as a logistical, economic event. And he sees how totally dysfunctional it is. And the central dysfunction is its decentralization, essentially. The 13 colonies have come together under the Articles of Confederation, which is really just a loose security pact. So Congress, the only national institution along with the Continental Army, doesn't even have the power to tax. It has to request money from the states. And the states are trying to channel their resources to only their state militias. And there's, major coordination problems and also just lack of resources. And so the centrality of a productive, wealthy economy to the project of military management, of warfare, and of sovereignty is driven home to him at an experiential level. And what he learns is the necessity for what social scientists today would call a fiscal military state, a state that can create economic conditions, that can borrow and tax and invest and basically guide an economy towards growth so as to be able to tax that economy, so as to be able to pay for its military and administrative infrastructure. I feel a little weird saying that because I'm not a huge fan. I'm not a huge fan. I'm a huge critic of the American military-industrial complex such as it is now. But going back to the 1770s and 1780s, we're dealing with a very different situation, a political experiment that was not guaranteed its survival. And the points I'm trying to make in this book aren't about America as such, but rather about political endeavors such as breaking with monarchism, starting a new form of political governance, Republican constitutional government, and in that process, also a new political economy, industrialization.
Mm-hmm. Sort of towards the end of the Revolutionary War and immediately following it, the U.S. enters into the so-called critical period, which, sees existential threats to the fledgling country in the form of mutinies and rebellions and just general economic turmoil. Can you talk a little bit about this stretch of American history, what Hamilton was up to during this period and how the events of the critical period further influenced his political thought?
Yeah. So the war, bizarrely, is, or contradictorily, it creates an economic boom. There's a lot of, means of production are being destroyed, but there's also tremendous stimulus. These three armies with their ravenous appetites for everything you can imagine, from shoes and weaponry to paper and salt and fodder. And so the war actually involves this inflationary boom. When the war ends, the economy, we now know, collapses into a depression that was equivalent to the Great Depression. And investment dries up. There are all these debts. And so serious economic crisis descends on the 13 colonies. there is at the same time a whole plethora of small military conflicts. There's a war between the governments of Georgia and South Carolina against Maroons, which is to say African Americans and people of African descent who had been enslaved, who escape slavery and live in autonomous armed communities. There is conflict from Georgia all the way up, through to what's now Ohio with Native American groups. There is, particularly in Kentucky, what's now Kentucky, not yet Kentucky, there's real violence between white settlers and Native Americans. There's violence between rival groups of white settlers. In what's now eastern Tennessee, there's a war of secession, a failed war of secession against North Carolina. In the Wyoming Valley of Pennsylvania, there are rival groups of settlers, one group from New England, the other group from Pennsylvania, backed by rival speculators, and they have an ongoing shooting war, actually. And there's also trade conflicts between different states. New York starts putting tariffs on New Jersey and Connecticut. Maryland and Virginia have a trade war over navigation and trade in the Chesapeake. So the whole project is sinking into economic stagnation and fragmenting politically and fragmenting militarily. In the background of all this, there are two major volcanic eruptions, one in Japan and one in Iceland. And the one in Iceland, they both happened in 1783. And the one in Iceland goes on for a whole year. And together, these create a cooling effect in the Northeast that leads to cold and wet summers that negatively impacts crop yields. And there's a lot of flooding. So very dangerous spring floods and really harsh winters. So that exacerbates the economic problem. All of this culminates in Shays' Rebellion. Now, there's one other factor in the critical period, which is that the states have borrowed enormous amounts of money, as had Congress, and they're now attempting to extract enormous amounts of wealth from this increasingly stagnant and suffering economy. So that just increases the burden on common people and hampers investment because it's mopping up all of these resources that could be thrown into production. All of this culminates in a mass foreclosure crisis in Western Massachusetts, but really spreading beyond there, down into Connecticut, up into New Hampshire, and a rebellion emerges among farmers to reject this. This blossoms into Shays' Rebellion, named for Daniel Shays, who was a Revolutionary War captain and is really only one of the leaders of this movement. They call themselves the Regulators. And in Massachusetts, the Regulators become an armed force. The state, and this begins in the summer of 1786. The Constitutional Convention will be in the summer of 1787. So the Regulators, Shayites, go and they just close down the courts. They throw the judges and the lawyers out and they say, you can't hold court, you can't evict people, the court is closed, get out of here. The state authorities muster the militia, and time and again, the militia either switch sides or they just refuse to get involved and dissolve away. So the Massachusetts government has to create a private army to go to war with the Shayites. And throughout the winter of 1786 into 87, there is this low-level guerrilla conflict that involves two actual battles between this private army and the Shayites, and lots of, guerrilla tactics, beating people up, burning houses and barns, murders here and there, threatening letters. And as the Shays' Rebellion is being mopped up in late May 1787, the Constitutional Convention convenes in Philadelphia. And it's very much in reaction to Shays' Rebellion, but not just Shays' Rebellion, to the whole panoply of problems that are the critical period.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you mentioned the Constitutional Convention, and out of that comes comes the Federalist Papers, of which Hamilton is the principal author. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about your reading of the Federalist Papers, and specifically Hamilton's contributions, and what they sort of tell us about his political theory of the nation state on the one hand and individual states, American states, on the other.
Yeah. In terms of the sort of political economy of government, Hamilton is very clear that government is an active economic force, an active economic agent. It doesn't just respond to what's going on in the private sector. It's not a passive recipient or an afterthought to what's going on in the private sector, but he realizes that it can actually be the prime mover of what is then recognized as the private sector. And he describes this in several of the papers. I forget the exact number, but it's in the book. About how the country, if it unifies, can force its conditions economically on other actors externally in the world system. And he's talking about it that way, but in doing that, in these discussions of how a unified and organized state can enforce its will on international trade, he's also reflecting on the fact that such a state can do that internally. And that will very much become part of his project, is that what he wants to do coming out of the critical period is drive a transition in the economy. And he's very clear that this is not going to happen naturally by the invisible hand. So there's that kind of recognition that the state creates economic conditions. It doesn't just react to them. In terms of the other part of your question about his suspicion of states, he's arguing with the states' rights lobby, the Jeffersonians. And this is not just a Southern set of interests, but it's primarily moved by the Southern elite who are jealous of their prerogatives, right? They're worried that this new, strong, centralized state that is being proposed will threaten their prerogatives. And their prerogatives are the right to own slaves, the right to import slaves, the right to sell slaves, and the right to conduct untaxed free trade with the metropole, the UK, right? The elites of South Carolina and Virginia are perfectly fine exporting raw materials to the UK and importing French wine and books. And they're worried that if these shipping and nascent manufacturing interests in the Northeast get hold of this state or too much of the power of this central state, then their arrangements are going to be threatened. The other prerogative that they're concerned about protecting is limiting the amount of tax on their property, right? They own enormous amounts of land and enormous numbers of people. This is not the average white Southerner. This is like that elite group of slave owners that owned the majority of slaves. Mm-hmm. And so they're concerned that this kind of vision that the Federalists in Hamilton have of this strong, administratively coherent, militarily powerful state is going to be expensive, and that they're going to have to pay for it. So they're arguing in their defense for the rights of states to maintain, to carry on their own business. And Hamilton is arguing against that. And the states' rights people, I mean, there's also a similar crew in New York. It's not just Southerners. It's also the ruling gangs in various states are concerned that they maintain business as usual. So they often dress this up as, in the language of democracy. And there's frequent reference to the size of states and how democracy can only work in small republics. Hamilton argues against that by saying essentially, like, what you're relying on Montesquieu here. You're referring back to Greek city-states, but we're way beyond that. Don't worry about, is the United States of America going to be too big to be democratic? Virginia is already too big to be democratic in the sense that like Athens or any Greek city-state was like, face-to-face democracy. And his fundamental concern, which is borne out by American history, is that two sovereignties cannot exist simultaneously in the same limits. And he says this is going to lead to war. The states' rights camp, they argue and say, look, standing armies, a central government that can tax, this will lead to despotism. And Hamilton says, no, actually, it's precisely the opposite. A strong standing army will produce peace, and peace is beneficial for democracy. And in fact, a fragmented sovereignty will lead to, or any kind of collection of small, totally sovereign states will lead to frequent warfare, and it's frequent warfare that leads to the rise of despotism and the fetishization of militaries and of officers and the kind of political culture that leads to dictatorship. And so he's not entirely successful in arguing against the power of the states. At the Constitutional Convention, he actually proposes the liquidation of the states. He wants to just create federal electoral districts, which, if you think about it, would mean we wouldn't have Donald Trump as president, and we wouldn't have had, 12 of the last 20 years have been minority rule between George Bush and Donald Trump, losing the electoral vote but winning in the electoral college. So he's not totally successful in kind of checking the power of the states, but he is borne out, in fact, right? The Civil War is the result of two conflicting sovereignties existing in the same space. And it is the state militias that go to war, right? And the reason the Confederates wore gray was that was the color of state militias uniforms.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. So, yeah, I mean, this theme of kind of like Jeffersonian liberalism or Jeffersonian democracy and Hamiltonism sort of centralization, I think, plays out in a number of different ways. And I wanted to return to something you mentioned before, in the sense that, the Hamiltonian theory of political economy in some ways, I think, sort of anticipates, Polanyi's idea that the state, sort of creates conditions and isn't just subject to them. And in this light, your book sort of understands the Constitution, if I'm reading it correctly, as a kind of like toolkit for state building. Can you talk about the ways in which the Constitution isn't just an outline for how democracy functions in the United States, but the ways in which it actually empowered governments to take action on behalf of the state itself and the people that it's responsible for?
So most of, to begin with, most of the literature on the Constitution is about how government works, right? That's the fundamental question. And so what I did was look at what this government allows itself to do, right? Never mind how it works, checks and balances, right? 3 branches of government, this and that, right? What does it set itself up to do? And it's very clearly the developmentalist state, the Diarist state in outline. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, which lays out the powers of Congress. The legislative branch is, at least in theory, supposed to be the supreme branch. It is the branch that can impeach the judiciary and it can impeach the executive, but they can't impeach the legislative branch. The legislative branch is, self-policing in that regard, and that kind of marks it as the branch that's supreme. So the mission of this government is laid out under Congress's powers, Article 1, Section 8, which is surprisingly not often dealt with in literature on the Constitution. And there's a lot of boring stuff in there, and so it's overlooked. But if you add this all up, some of it is, quite important for economic development, controlling bankruptcies, regulating foreign trade, regulating commerce between the states, the right to build infrastructure. There's one line in the postal clause over, Congress shall have the power to establish post offices and post roads. And Benjamin Franklin wanted an explicit mention of canals in there. He was defeated. That becomes very important, that little word, post roads. In the early 19th century, the post office becomes a huge public works agency, huge by the standards of that day, building thousands of miles of roads, clearing rivers. The post office plays an important role even into the 20th century. The beginning of aviation was subsidized by the federal government when the federal government contracted with these nascent airlines to carry the mail. I mean, so on and on and on, we see actually the role of the post office has been really important as a builder of infrastructure to promote the progress of science and useful arts, right? I mean, that becomes the fact that the U.S. up until recently did about half of the world's R&D, and most of that was publicly funded. That's due to this. Dealing with counterfeiting, regulating money, weights and measures. And weights and measures, you can say that's pretty boring and weird and silly, but if you don't have standardization of quantitative measurement, how is a modern economy to work? And it actually took a long time for that to be worked out. Every state had different forms of money, different measurements. A hogshead of beer in Boston was 1 gallon different from a hogshead of beer in Baltimore. That stuff's not actually really worked out until the 1830s, I believe. So those, and the power to tax, and the power to borrow, and the power to print money. So that's all in Article 1, Section 8, and that's the skeleton upon which Hamilton will then layer other ideas and powers and facilities, such as a publicly controlled bank. It's not completely publicly controlled, but an autonomous central bank that's 20% owned by the state. So yeah, that's how. And the funny thing about the Constitution is that, you know, the last time it was really dealt with as an economic document was Charles Beard in 1913. And what he did was looked at all of the signers and what they owned and how they would benefit from the Constitution, and particularly from the later assumption of state debts by the federal government, just what they had to gain from this new Constitution. And he established, you know, lo and behold, they're elites, and a strong government will help these elites, right? And then he becomes the whipping boy of the right. And, you know, they condemn him for being economistic, et cetera, which he is a little bit. But, you know, that was the last time we looked at the Constitution as an economic document. So this is trying to revive, you know, it's an opening gambit for like, hey, let's rethink our Constitution as an economic document as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then, you know, he pushes this program even further when he becomes Secretary of the Treasury. And you know,
I forgot one key thing. This is really senior moment. The general welfare clause. This is one of the most contentious clauses in Article 1, Section 8, because it's like the get out of jail free card. It's like, and anything like, and Congress has the right to pass any necessary laws in the name of national defense and the general welfare. And Jefferson and the small government, low tax states' rights people immediately take issue with that. They're like, what does that mean? That could mean anything. And I kind of agree with them, and that's what I like about it. It's like, yeah, it potentially opens the door for all sorts of progressive transformations.
Yeah. As a side note to that, can you talk a little bit about how that connects with sort of the fight and debate over slavery and the slave trade in the United States?
Yeah, I mean, the Constitution never uses the word slave or slavery, but it deals with slavery, and it both protects and limits slavery. It protects slavery in the 3/5 clause, which allows enslaved people in slave states to be counted as regards the proportion of the distribution of congressional seats. So that means that the slave states have these safe seats that politicians from slave states have to win over fewer voters. Their voting base is smaller because everyone who is enslaved counts for representational purposes as, you know, 3/5 of a voter. There's the fugitive slave law. There's the extradition treaties are required between states, and that means that will become the basis for the fugitive slave laws that follow, which use federal power to force free states to return people who have escaped from slavery back to slavery. This becomes very contentious in the run-up to the Civil War. The Constitution also protects but opens the door for the end of the slave trade. It says that the slave trade will not be shut down before 1808, and that clause can't be amended for 20 years. So that you can read that as protection of slavery, which it is, but it's also opening the door for a repression of slavery. The Constitution opens the door for emancipation in that there are no property qualifications, there are no gender restrictions, there are no racial restrictions on voting and office holding. So, you know, for 18th century, that's actually pretty progressive. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's a contradictory and brokered document. Yeah. In that regard, and in every regard, really, it's a brokered document, mm-hmm. and its power and its pathology lie in that kind of muddled, brokered quality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, fast forwarding a little bit, you know, Hamilton becomes Secretary of the Treasury, and his, you know, that period in large part is defined, as you show, by a series of the reports that he issued that sort of outlined, you know, plans, a blueprint for American economic development. Your book focuses particularly on what you argue is an often overlooked report, and that is the report on the subject of manufacturers. What does that report contain, and what does it tell us about Hamilton's broader political economy?
So the report on manufacturers is actually, that's how I kind of backed into this book by mistake. I was reading about Hamilton, and I saw mention of this report, and it sounded so at odds with the standard story of American political economic development and of Hamilton as a sort of, patron saint of finance and free trade. So the report is, and then it's always mentioned in these biographies of Hamilton, discussions of the time, but the contradictions in how it was discussed, it became clear to me that, and then also the errors, that people were not actually reading this. So the report comes at the end of a series of reports. He begins his job as Treasury of the Secretary, Secretary of the Treasury, issuing a series of reports to Congress about the mint, about the bank, about public lands. And all of this is sort of laying the groundwork, making the argument for creating a mint, creating a public bank, or not a fully public bank, a central bank, creating a tax and internal revenue system, for assuming the debts of states in exchange for that the central government will borrow money abroad, buy the debts of states, and in exchange the states will give the federal government their land claims, many of which were totally overlapping and conflicting and completely chaotic and went like all the way out. They didn't even know, Lewis and Clark's expedition is, 2 decades in the future. And it's like in Notes on the State of Virginia, Thomas Jefferson is asked to describe Virginia's boundaries. And it's like the western boundary doesn't exist. It's just like that way, as far as you can go. So all the reports deal with all this stuff. And then the final report is the report on the subject of manufacturers. And when you actually read it, it opens with an attack on Adam Smith. When I read that, I was like, oh, that's why we never read the report on manufacturers, because it attacks, the basis, the greatest thinker in the tradition of laissez-faire. Even though there are lots of contradictions in Smith, like in Wealth of Nations, Smith actually says, well, it's okay for government to intervene when national defense and security are concerned. For example, the Navigation Acts, and like the Navigation Acts, which he kind of, slips over, are essentially the basis for British mercantilist empire building. So it's like, Smith acknowledges that in fact state power is central to how the British economy and the British Empire works, but he doesn't discuss it. Mostly he's interested in, this nascent manufacturing and the buying and selling and all that. So anyway, and he champions free trade and laissez-faire. Thomas Jefferson considers Wealth of Nations the best book in existence. It was very popular among the founders. Hamilton apparently wrote a treatment of it that's lost to us. But he opens the report with this attack on Smith. And he basically says, look, if you're the UK and you're already wealthy and developed, this works for you. But in our situation, this is not going to work out for us. We need to use state power to shape economic conditions to our benefit. We can't receive them passively as if they were the weather or whatever. So he begins with this attack on Adam Smith, and then he goes on to attempts to placate the South, and trying to say that, if industrialization is supported by the government, if manufacturing, they don't use the word industrialization, manufacturing is a term, factories, the very first factory has just developed in 1784 in the UK. This is written in 1790, 91. So we're talking about, workshops here primarily. It's like the vision of the big satanic mills. That's like doesn't even really exist yet. So he says that the South will actually benefit if there is a government program to pursue a manufacturing transition to manufacturing, because there'll be greater demand for all of their products. And he goes into great detail of that. And then he lays out, he says, okay, so how are we going to and he makes the case for why do we want a manufacturing-based economy? And we want it because it's the way that we will increase labor productivity, essentially. He doesn't use those terms. But it basically says, look, well, if you accept the division of labor and automation, this massively increases the productivity of labor. This produces more wealth. And that means there's going to be more wealth for everyone. He doesn't get into the question of equitable distribution. He's not a progressive in that regard. But he is correct that, like, industrialization produces more wealth, both in terms of exchange values and use values. And he says, and that will be then the basis for this government to protect itself, to manage, to invest and build up the conditions for further investment and development by the private sector, and also to secure itself militarily and administratively in a hostile world of huge empires. The Spanish, the French, the British are all pressing in on this new experiment. Finally, after he's made these arguments, he then lists what he calls the means proper. And if this is like the list of the toolkit. And each one of these in and of themselves are not particularly interesting, but you put them all together and see that he's arguing for their use in concert under a plan, and it becomes more significant. So he argues for tariffs, for what we would call subsidies, for whole categories of goods, for subsidies, what he calls bounties, for specific firms, investment in research and development, investment in and public ownership of the transportation system, tax breaks, drawbacks as he calls it, from tariffs from these tariffs. The government has to have the right to ban the export of certain strategic raw materials, and it should simultaneously encourage the tax-free import of other strategic raw materials, to make sure that there's a functioning credit system. A lot of it reiterates what's parts of some of what's in Article 1, Section 8. And it ends with a proposal. The final proposal is for a board to promote the useful arts of manufacturing and science. I forget the exact wording. And that part is never pursued, but like that is essentially, it's like a proposal for the kind of thing that you see in Japan under the famous Ministry of International Trade and Industry, MITI, right? And this is the body within the developmentalist state in Japan that really kind of guides the whole project of industrialization. And many other states that were influenced by the American experience actually include that sort of central planning board. It's not quite Gosplan a la the Soviet sort of central planning agency, but I mean, that is the last proposal in the report, is that there should be a central, board for guiding this whole thing. Mm-hmm. So the typical story is that the report on manufacturers is smacked down and seen as a step too far, but that's not entirely true. The tariff is adopted, the drawbacks, certain prohibitions on exporting raw materials, the subsidies. There is a campaign of industrial espionage led by the federal government. Tench Cox and Hamilton actively recruit skilled laborers from the UK. The United States does what China will do later, which is steal the intellectual property of the imperial power, right? We steal the blueprints for British cotton mills and then replicate them here. China has been accused of and has done the same thing around wind turbines and stuff like that. And I say more power to them. That's basically, that's how countries industrialize, whether you like it or not, is they usually capture by hook or by crook the best technologies from wealthy economies that aren't willing to give and share those technologies. Mm-hmm. So some of the report is taken on by the federal level. It is ultimately the whole kind of federalist developmentalist agenda hits the rocks of the Adams administration, which becomes very despotic and paranoid. Hamilton is out of government, but he supports Adams' repression. Adams passes the Alien and Sedition, or signs the Alien and Sedition Acts, and there's a wave of repression against editors that oppose the Adams administration. This really damages the reputation of the Federalists, and then in 1800, Thomas Jefferson is elected in what's called the Revolution of 1800. And Jefferson guts all of these internal taxes, which is typically described as a kind of progressive thing, because alcohol and paper, candles were things that regular people used regularly were taxed. And so eliminating these internal taxes was seen as unburdening the populace of this. But what's often left out is also carriages were taxed, slaves were taxed, land was taxed, houses were taxed. So elites were taxed, the property of elites were taxed. And so Jefferson gets rid of all of that, reduces the federal intake goes from 300 million down to, I think it's 37 million, or maybe it's 50 million. Massive decrease in the amount of income to the federal government, reduces the size of the Navy, pulls in the revenue cutters, the sort of coastal taxing police. And lo and behold, what happens is the British start exerting more and more power and boarding American ships and seizing American ships, seizing American sailors, claiming that anyone who is Briton is basically the human property of the British monarchy. They say they're British subjects. You're not allowed to change. You're not a citizen. You don't get to renounce your citizenship and go somewhere else. You're always a British subject. So come with us. So anyway, but then I'm getting a bit ahead of the story of this report on manufacturers. So more importantly, it's also then taken up at the state level. When the Jeffersonians, meaning Jefferson and then Madison after him, abandoned this, and they let the bank, which is chartered for 20 years, they let that expire. That will prove highly problematic when war comes. But the states, many of them pick this up. Most famously, the Erie Canal. New York endorses this project. It gets a little bit of assistance from the Jefferson administration in the form of gifts of federal land. But this canal, which Jefferson thought was madness, proves to be tremendously successful, pays for itself, and there's a public agency that builds this canal. It's sort of the model for federal contracting up to this day, where there's a public agency that is essentially the primary contractor that then doles out subcontracts to the private sector. And this helps open the interior West, the Ohio country, and turns New York into the great trading entrepot that it is to this day. And other states, then canal mania kind of builds from that. And Henry Clay champions Hamilton's ideas. What's known as the American School becomes known as the American System under Henry Clay. And among others, Frederick List from Germany comes over to the US in the 1820s, is very influenced by these ideas in Pennsylvania as they're being exercised by the state government. Henry Clay does a lot of this in Kentucky, even though he's both in Kentucky and in national government. And then these ideas influence Germany. List goes back to Germany, and the American system there becomes the national system. List becomes part of sort of the first generation, or influential in the first generation, of the German Historical School of Economics, which is a kind of nationalist, developmentalist school of economics that is fundamentally at odds with free trade, right? It rejects the kind of Anglo-Saxon ideas about free trade as just illusions, as just simply not how things work, not how economies develop, and it accepts as natural that there needs to be planning and subsidy and guidance, carrots and sticks to drive industrialization.
So you've mentioned the ways in which, sort of like classic imperial powers like Germany and Japan sort of embraced a Hamiltonian approach to state building. But when I think about that period of history, that Hamilton was grappling with, the United States looks very much like, so-called third world states in the decolonial period after the Second World War, especially. And I'm wondering, are there lessons to be drawn from Hamilton's theory of political economy for those states, or have radical economists in the third world embraced a type of Hamiltonianism and tried to make it work for their home countries?
Yeah, I think there are lessons to be learned, and economists have. As I was wrapping up this book, I was with some of my colleagues from John Jay in a bar in Brooklyn, and started a conversation with this older gentleman who turned out had been in the Ugandan government, had been a guerrilla with Museveni, and had then been in the Ugandan government, had been a diplomat in the U.S. And and I was interested in his experiences, and I was also interested particularly in Paul Kagame, who's now head of Rwanda and head of the Rwandan People's Front, and is heavily criticized in the U.S. press, and is not a darling by any means. But there are a lot of pretty unsavory presidents in Africa, and it's interesting that Paul Kagame is picked out for criticism quite often. And I think it's because he does stuff like, refuse to run a balanced budget. A couple years ago, he was insisting that Rwanda had to have free higher education from, K through 12. And the IMF and the World Bank were saying, no, you cannot run a 3% budget deficit. You have to run a balanced budget. And he said, we're not going to do that, And surprise, surprise, he was criticized. So I was interested in kind of like, what were they thinking? And what was Paul Kagame's thinking? They all started out as Marxist guerrillas, and now what is Paul Kagame doing? And he said we were Hamiltonian always. It was always like, it was about sovereignty and the nation. And if socialism was the horse to ride in that direction, okay. But when that didn't work, then it becomes this this other thing. So yes, states in the global South do use this in a kind of pragmatic, sense. It's not that this kind of dirigiste path to development leads to utopian outcomes, but it's a kind of realist approach to survival in a highly unequal world system that is global capitalism. Mm-hmm. The report and these Hamiltonian ideas are explicitly studied in East Asia. There's a whole book on that by an Australian whose name I'm forgetting, but he's cited in the book, looking at the Hamiltonian influence on the Japanese experience. And they still read Hamilton in South Korea, China, Hong Kong, these places, because it's seen as an original template, an original draft on the kinds of policies that have made these economies very wealthy. And so, and the specific trajectory is it goes Germany, and then the national system, and those experiments that List is very involved with. And then Japan in the 1850s is being threatened by Western gunboats and being forced to open to free trade. And the Japanese elites realize that they have to modernize. They have been, maintaining a kind of artificially secured version of a medieval feudalism. So they overthrow the shogunate, they restore the emperor, and so this is the Meiji Restoration. But really what's going on is a group of urban, professional modernizers are having a revolution, and they bring in European, particularly German engineers and officers and bureaucrats, and pursue a similar strategy. And then the Japanese, who are guilty of, terrible imperial practices in the 1930s, et cetera. But these ideas go with them, and even the enemies of the Japanese experiment are heavily influenced by it. So the South Koreans then very much model the Japanese, who have occupied Korea. And, your average Korean politician in the early 60s is not a fan of the Japanese, but they pursue the very same kind of policies. And then you get, South Korea is it's the most radical story of industrialization in world history. Incomes soar, and there's tons of class struggle amidst this. It's not like everybody is getting along, but there's this state guiding the whole thing and trying to balance the various class forces, and using not just carrots but also sticks. So in South Korea, they would set production targets for steel companies, and steel companies that didn't make these production targets, they also nationalized finance. Steel companies that couldn't make the production targets didn't get credit, and then just got, cannibalized and parceled out to the successful steel companies. They had a law on the books that said if anyone was guilty of capital flight, taking money out of the country of $1 million or more, they were minimum sentence of 10 years, maximum sentence death penalty. No one was ever killed, but there were rich people who absconded with their personal wealth to try to hide it abroad, who the South Korean state threw in prison. And because basically the project was, okay, you can get rich, that's fine, but you have to invest your money here. You have to help build the South Korean economy. You have to transform us from, a war-battered agrarian economy to an industrial powerhouse. Along the way, you want to get rich, that's fine, but you don't get to get rich and then leave and damage this economy. So yeah, these ideas definitely have an influence to this day all over the planet. And I mean, China is very Hamiltonian, for better and for worse. You know, you could say, on the one hand, it's like the Chinese experiment in this weird kind of, you know, communist party-led mixed economy capitalism has lifted 300 million people out of poverty. On the other hand, it's created horrendous environmental damage. So I'm not saying, you know, I'm not proposing this. You know, I'm reporting from history, and primarily from American history with an eye to the present, about the utility of the Dyer-Geest model. I'm not necessarily advocating it, but I'm trying to resurrect its presence in American history, because I think people are unaware of how central it has actually been to the development of this economy.
Mm-hmm. So we're starting to run a little short on time, but before we go, you know, you mentioned sort of lessons for the current moment, and some of the environmental damage that industrialization produces. And you know, at the end of the book, you gesture towards a green Hamiltonianism, and I was hoping that you could sort of wrap up by talking about how Hamilton's, you know, political theory and political economy should and can influence the way in which we think about tackling the climate crisis that we're presented with.
Well, I mean, dealing with the climate crisis requires euthanizing the fossil fuel industry and building out a new clean energy infrastructure. That is a project of green reindustrialization. How are we to do that? Well, we could do worse than looking back at our own history and seeing how the first industrial revolution actually happened. And it wasn't just private entrepreneurs alone in their workshops, saving their pennies, borrowing on the private market to launch all of this. The government was there at every turn, supporting and guiding and subsidizing and planning, and often having the vision and encouraging entrepreneurs down certain paths. And I think that's important to recognize. It's important to recognize that economic planning and an economically active government is not something new. It's not something exotic. It's not something foreign. It's something very organic and original to American economic development. Not all of its effects have been good, you know, but the point is, the kinds of policies we need to fast forward a transition to clean energy are not exotic. They're actually as American as apple pie, and we need to demystify that. And I, you know, I think it's important to make policies like that to reveal how they are very American, because for better or for worse, a lot of Americans are patriotic and very tied up with the, you know, American exceptionalism and like things better if they can think of them as kind of the country that and culture that they're part of. And so that's what I'm trying to do with this. And I mean, another way to put it is, like, I guess at a sort of like aesthetic level, I'm making right-wing arguments for left-wing policies, right? It's like, you know, socialistic planning, government ownership of parts of the means of production, setting targets and goals, punishing business when it fails, you know, rewarding it when it does what it's told to do. I mean, this is not foreign. This is very organic to our own economic history.
Well, we're just about out of time. So, Christian, thank you again for joining us this afternoon. This is great. And I encourage everybody to go out and purchase your new book, Radical Hamilton, Economic Lessons from a Misunderstood Founder, out now from Verso Press. And to everybody out there that tuned in, thank you for your time. And we will look forward to seeing you all again soon. Christian, thanks so much.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.
Have a great day.
Bye.
Bye.